Okay, I think that'll do it. Get the stream started. Let's get the sound on and get the stream started. All right. Well, welcome back. I'm Kolan Wright, and we're going to be doing some very fun stuff today. We're going to be doing the abomination of desolation. So, this is a very large topic. There's a lot of debate and controversy of how do we approach this scripture. And I hopefully I'll be able to illuminate some things and hopefully correct a couple of things that I think are we've looked at incorrectly. So we will definitely dive into that. So, what we're going to be doing is, of course, the abomination. Now, today we're going to be primarily looking at Mark and Matthew and Daniel 11 and 12. Daniel 9 is a huge topic. I will be doing that one probably next week, God willing. I do have to leave out of town for a funeral. But that will be about a 4 to 6 week. I'm still praying about it because Daniel 9 is just so complex. And I think you'll see that when we finally dive into that. And then we will then deal with Daniel 8 after that. That also talks somewhat about this issue. And we're going to have to tie that in to Daniel 7. So, about all of those things are going to be going on probably over the next 2 months because this topic is so big and so broad and important before we can move into the next step. So, where have we been and where are we going? Abomination of desolation. So, what we've looked at so far, and I talked a little bit about when we talked about desolations, we talked about how there were this vengeance that God was going to perform against the Jews during the Babylonian time period, and that then we had another vengeance of God in Rome in 70 AD. What we're going to be talking about today is this Antiochus, this abomination of desolation, and how these play a role. So, we can also see that Babylon was also a type for desolation of the nations. So we see this for Israel. There was four desolations. Three have happened in the past, and one is still future. How I'm going to present this, and then the nations would also have a desolation. So Babylon would be desolated, and then in the future, there's going to be nations, mystery Babylon, the beast empires, which will be as a type from previous desolations. So we've outlined six different types of desolations, major themes of desolation so far. And these are all types and shadows. So you can see that these are past events. So we've had initial Israel's desolation. The Babylonians were desolated after Jew by the Medes and Persians. We had the Antiochus desolation that occurred, and we had then Israel's desolation 70 AD. And these were all past events. And then we still have these future events, which we're going to start with this abomination of desolation. So that's kind of where we're going to be going with things, where we've come from, and where we're going to be going. So, where do we start? We start with the two verses in the New Testament that we deal with the abomination of desolation. We start in Mark 13, through 13b and 14a. And it says basically, but the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. And it goes through everything else. Flee to the mountains, that. In Matthew 24, we read something very similar, and then the end will come. And I think this is really important that we realize that Jesus is making a transition here. He's saying the person who endures to the end will be saved, but when you see the abomination, and then he says, then the end will come. So when you take these two verses together, you understand that this is what Jesus is speaking of then the end coming. And so when we talk about end, we're going to talk about that in relationship. When we talk in Daniel 9, he talks about the end. And that's where we're going to bring in what it means to be the end. But it says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of through Daniel the prophet. So Matthew gives us good information that it's from Daniel. You don't have to go looking anywhere else. This is from Daniel. And when you see him standing in, can we understand what desolation in this context means? King Z, what do you mean by desolation in which context? The context of the Babylonian destruction, the context of the desolation in 70 AD, the abomination of desolation? Because I'm going to get into what the abomination of desolation means in this context. So we're actually right after this slide, we're going to talk about the two primary words that are used for abomination, if that answers your question. So hit me up in the chat if it doesn't answer your question. Desolation itself. Okay, so desolation itself, that was a topic that I discussed two episodes ago. And I went through the six major types of desolation. And if you go back and look at those videos, but these are the major desolations. So there's four for Israel. And I covered it in a big slide. So there's four major types of desolation for Israel. Three are in the past, and one is yet to be in the future, this abomination of desolation. And that was 2 videos ago. And then there's two types of desolations for the nations, and Babylon is a type of desolation and the nation. So if you want more information, I'm sorry, but you'll have to go back and watch that whole video. All right, so I'm going to move on. So we have this abomination of desolation, and desolation. I can give you the idea of desolation is this idea of wilderness. This idea. Um, it's the idea of it not being habitable. It's not being able to something that's useful. So when the land is desolated, it's no longer useful. It's called a wilderness. When the temple is desolated, it's no longer useful. If a person is desolated, they're no longer useful. So this idea of desolation. Now, let's take a look at this a word abomination. So we have these two words that are put together, abomination of desolation. There's two primary Hebrew Old Testament words that are used for desolation. We have this word shikutz, which is right here, and it's used 27 times. Now, this is the word that is used when we see abomination of desolation in Daniel. Shikutz is the word that's used. It's used on both of those times. And this one is most likely related to an idol, and we're going to look at that more closely. There is another word that's actually used more frequently, and it's toeva. Toeva is used 117 times, and it's used multiple times in many different ways. It's used as sacrifice when they use sacrifices that they said that let us go out and sacrifice to our God out in the wilderness when they were in front of Pharaoh. And he says, because this is an abomination to the Egyptians, that's this word. When a male is laying with a male, when you're uncovering someone's nakedness, if they're laying with an animal, if you lay with someone's wife and have adultery, if you're sacrificing children, if you abominations of other nations, if you're acting unjustly, it's called an abomination. And then it's also used of idols to other gods. Whereas shikutz, and so let's take a look at a couple of examples of toeva. So toeva, and we're going to see it in two contexts here. We're going to look at 2 Kings 23:13. The high places which were before Jerusalem, which were on the right of the Mount of Destruction, which Solomon the king had built for Ashtaroth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the sons of Ammon, the king defiled. Now, two of these times we get the word toivah. One of these times we actually get the word shikutz. So this one actually has both words, but they're all translated as abomination. Let's take a look at Ezekiel 33:29. Ezekiel 33:29. And then they will know that I am the Lord when I make the land a desolation. So this idea of wilderness, this land's being desolated, it's no longer useful. It's a waste because of all their abominations which they have committed. So Israel had committed all these abominations. This is the word to'ivah. A couple more. Jeremiah 44:22. So the Lord was no longer able to endure it because of the evil of your deeds, because of the abominations, to'ivah, which you have committed. And thus your land has become a ruin, right? This idea of ruin, object of horror. This is that same word desolation, but this time translated as horror. A curse and without inhabitants, not useful anymore. Because of the abominations, it's no longer useful. All right. So that kind of gives us a flavor of how to'ivah is used. Now let's go into a little bit more of this word abomination of desolations, abominations of how it's used in the New Testament and in the Old. So if we're looking at the word abomination of desolation, in the New Testament, there is this word badelgama, badelgama, and it's used only 6 times. It's only used 6 times. It's not used in Luke. This word badelgama is not used in Luke at all. So abomination is not used in Luke. It's only used in Matthew and Mark, and then it's used 3 times in Revelation, and then one other time in the New Testament. So let's take a look real quick at how it's used in the New Testament. So let's look at Revelation 17:4 and 5. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, and having in her left hand a cup, golden cup full of abominations, the unclean things of her immorality. So this idea of abominations, uncleanness, this thing that's detestable in God's sight, abominations. And it's the same thing we kind of saw how it was used in the Old Testament. And on her forehead was written a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. So we're starting to tie in this Babylon with abominations and this future desolation of mystery Babylon, of how this harlot is going to be a type for the future of what happened in the past to Babylon. So we also see in Revelation 21:27, we see Revelation 21:27, and nothing unclean and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever enter into it. So this is that heavenly Jerusalem that we see up here, that there's going to be no temple in it. This is that future um, kingdom, this eternal kingdom. There will be no abomination, no one who practices abomination. So, abomination is not only something that can be set up, but it's also something that somebody practices, something that somebody does. It's an action. So those are primarily how it's used. And then, of course, we have the abomination of desolation in Matthew and Mark. And so we see that something is there's going to be some practice, there's going to be something that is set up. And we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So let's take a look at shikutz. Let's take a look at this word here that's used in the Old Testament, and it's used 27 times. So we're going to look at this one a little bit more in depth of what this abomination is. Now, of course, it's used in Daniel 11, and we're going to go into that a little more, Daniel 12, and it's used in Daniel 9. So, but let's take a look at a couple other spots. Let's look at 1 Kings 11:5. 1 Kings 11:5, we see, for Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. So this word here, detestable, is the word shikutz. That's the abomination. So it's not only something that's an abomination, it's it's detestable, and it's associated here with idol. So it's detestable idol. And you see the way that these are two noun words that are used together. Just like abomination of desolation, they're both noun words. So it's something that's an object. It's something that happens there. It does. It's a person, place, or thing. It's something. It's not just an action. So we're seeing something that's an idol. Let's take a look. It goes down in here into 7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab. So again, Solomon actually built a high place, built an idol for Chemosh. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 15:8. Now, when Asa heard these words and the prophecy which Azariah, the son of Oded, the prophet, spoke, he took courage and removed the abominable idols from the land of Judah and Benjamin. So, again, abomination, abominable, is related to idols. So, when shikutz is used, we see it used again and again related to an idol, something that's being set up, which goes along with what we've seen in Daniel. When you see the abomination standing in the holy place, something physical standing, an idol, something set up. Let's take a look at a couple more. Jeremiah 7:30. For the sons of Judah have done that which is evil in my sight. They have set their detestable things, this word here it is, shikutz, detestable thing or abomination, in the house which is called by my name, to defile it. So they set something up in the house, in the temple, God's place, to defile it. And shikutz is used again and again in this manner. I want to show you a couple more. Ezekiel 5:11. So as I live, declares the Lord God, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable idols. Boom, here it is right there. Shikutz, with detestable idols, and with your abominations. That's to'ivah. That is those other abominations, those other lists that we're getting there. Therefore, I will also withdraw. My eye will have no pity and I will not spare. So this idea of detestable abominations, again, is associated with idols, and set up in the sanctuary. It's built up on the high places. It's something that somebody sets up that is an object of worship. Now let's look at it a little bit more in a larger context. So this is Ezekiel 11, and we're going to start in verse 14 to get the context. We're going to be looking in verse 18, but verse 14 to get the context, and we're going to go through 21. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, your brothers, your relatives, your fellow exiles, the whole house of Israel, all of them, are those whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem said, Go far from the Lord. This land has been given to us as a possession. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, though I had removed them far away among the nations, though I had scattered them among the nations and the countries, yet I was a sanctuary for them a little while in the countries where they had gone. So, therefore, say, Thus says the Lord, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries among which you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. So, this is the idea of bringing them back into the land. And in my previous discussions, I suggest that this is that regathering time that we're seeing now, that we're seeing for Israel right now. Um, and or that future scattering time that Israel is going to be scattered, and we're going to see how that works with the abomination. Verse 18: When they come there, they will remove all its detestable things and all its abominations from it. So again, this is the word shekutz. They're going to remove all the detestable things, all the abominations, and its abominations from it. So that word toivah. I will give them one heart and put new spirit within them. And I will take the heart of stone out of their flesh and give them the heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances to do them. Then they will be my people, and I shall be their gods. But as for those whose hearts go after their detestable things and abominations, I will bring their conduct down on their head. So again, this word shekutz and this word to'ivah. So if you go after these things, if you go after your own idols, if you go after your own abominations, and we saw that list of to'ivah abominations, of those practices that people do, I will bring their conduct down on their heads. So this idea of shekutz, of abomination, desolation, is more associated with idols, of setting something up in the temple of God or in place of God, something that somebody worships. So that's the concept that we have, that we go into when we're thinking about this Old Testament abomination of desolation, specifically this word shekutz. So now let's go into the use of the association of abomination. Oh, I just want to go over desolation. So here's the word desolation. I brought it from the other one so people would have an idea of the word desolation that I talked about before. So there's two primary words that were used. There's samem, and then there's I'm going to mess this one up again. Shamama. Anyways, the word for abomination of desolations is this samem word here. And we can see that used when we look in Daniel, we see it used these times. So it's used in these Daniel passages that we're going to be looking at today. It's used in Daniel 9, which we will be looking at, and it's used in Daniel 8. However, the word abomination, shekutz, is not used in Daniel 8, which is why we're not looking at that one immediately. But this idea of to make inhabit it, desert it, and to get away and to make wilderness. All right. Now, if we look at the words abomination and desolation, and we look at them that are used together, there's 7 primary times that they're used in the Old Testament in the same passage. Now, or in the entire Bible, sorry, not just in the Old Testament. It's used twice in Mark and Matthew, which we've already looked at, the abomination, desolation. It's used twice in Daniel 11 and 12, and it's used the shekutz samem, the exact phrase is used in both of these. Then in Daniel 9, you get this word shekutz and samem for the ones who make desolate and abominations, but they're not used in the same phrase. They're not used abomination of desolation. We get, and on the wing in Daniel 9:27, right here, on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured on the one who makes desolate. So it's talking about an activity of what somebody is going to do rather than the actual object itself, right? So if the abomination of desolation is the actual object, the detestable idols, the things that set up, this one is the abomination of the one who does it, the one who actually does it. Like kind of like when Solomon made and set up that the high place of Chemosh. It was a detestable idol. Solomon was the one who set up the abomination that desolates. So in that situation, on the wing of abominations, that the Chemosh idol will come one, Solomon, who made it desolate. So if we were to put it into that context, so hopefully that helps you understand that difference of how this is used differently than Daniel 11 and 12. So Daniel 9 is used differently. So today we're going to be looking at Daniel 11 and 12 of how that's used because we get a lot of information, a lot of information. Now, there's two more times that it's used in the Old Testament. It's used in Ezekiel 33:29, where you see abomination and desolation used together. But both of it is different. There's the other words. It's toivah and it's semama. Uh, anyways, again, I butcher some of these words, um, but those are used of two different words. It's not used in that formulation. It's not used in abomination of desolation. So I think that these two words we're not going to, these two passages we're not going to really look at because I don't think it's really speaking of the same event. We can read them real quick. Ezekiel 33:29. Then they will know that I'm the Lord when I make the land a desolation and waste because of all of their abominations which they've committed. Again, speaking to someone that God's going to perform because of what they have done. And Jeremiah 44:22, the Lord can no longer bear your evil deeds and the abominations that you have committed. Again, this idea of committed, the idea of this to'ivah is the things that they're doing, whether it's male with a male, a human with an animal, adultery, whatever that action is. Therefore, your land has become a desolation and a waste and a curse without inhabitant to this day. So we really have narrowed it down to 5 usages, and the 3 usages that we're going to be looking at, so specifically shakut samem, is used in Daniel, exactly what Jesus was saying in Matthew. It's the only time that they're used in that combination and those 2 words specifically in the entire Old Testament. I find that very, very fascinating. All right. Now, let us go and let us look at Daniel. So let us look at Daniel 31 and Daniel 11:31 and Daniel 12:11. Start with 12:11 first, and I'll show you why in a second. But we see in Daniel 11:31, forces from him will arise to desecrate the sanctuary and do away with the regular sacrifice. They will set up the abomination of desolation. Again, this idea of setting up something that's detestable and idol that they're putting together. Then in Daniel 12:11, and this is where we're going to start more in-depth study. Daniel 12:11. From the time the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. Okay. Now, Jesus was talking when we look at Matthew 24:15, just before that in 14. And then the end will come. So this is going to be something I'm going to tell you right out. This should be something future. something future to when Jesus spoke. So Jesus spoke in about 30 to 32 AD. So this discussion there, and we can disagree or argue about when exactly, but it was 32 or 30 AD. So that was the means something this abomination is going to be sometime in the future. And when it does come, it's going to signal the end. So, when we see that abomination of desolation, or when we see the sacrifice abolished, there's going to be 1290 days. So, we have to understand we're trying to build a timeline here. What does that 1290 days entail? But first, we have to understand the passage. So, let us take a look at this passage a little more in depth. Now, when I was reading this and I was studying and trying to understand the end times, whenever we talk about something, we have to ask something when there's a time frame, when there's a time of 1290 days. Let's say that you say that there's going to be 10 days until you go to this, go to the park, or there's 10 days until you go on your trip or on vacation. That's from a point now when you speak until that happens. So if we're taking this from the time the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that is set up, that makes desolate set up, there shall be 1290 days. Well, what's the two? We see that there's a from. So when I was studying this, I'm like, well, where's the two? But there is one version that gives us an interesting that we don't see often. It's called Young's Literal Translation. And that one reads, from the time the turning aside of the perpetual sacrifice and to the giving out of the desolating abomination are days 1290. They put this word to in here. And what they're saying is from the time of the sacrifice to the abomination, there's 1290 days, which is not the typical way that I've seen it suggested. So I went back and looked at the Hebrew. And obviously, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I can look at the Hebrew. And I made this chart. And I took all the Hebrew words that are actually in that. And let me show you the Hebrew here. So let's take a look here. This is the first time I'm doing this. We're going to put up the English version here. And if you take a look, you can see that there are the actual Hebrew words. And there's a number underneath them: 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Here's 4. So 4 actually Hebrew comes before this one up here. And then it's 7, 10, 11, 9, 8, 9. You see how this is out of order? So what I did is I went back and I put them in order. So this one is 1, this one is 2, this one's 3. So I put them in the actual order of the Hebrew, and I rearranged it to make it go from left to right, just because my brain works that way. I'm used to reading English from from left to right, even though Hebrew goes from right to left. But I made it so my brain could understand it. And so this is the actual Hebrew word order. And then these are the words right here: min, et, swar, ha, tamid. And I'm going to translate tamid and keep it as that Hebrew word. There's again this w, and there's the lamed right here. So if you go through and you translate each word and just the word, and I'm not trying to make it more smooth, it says, and from time remove the sacrifice or burnt offering, and to setting up or placing abomination, desolation, day 1290. So basically, it's the same thing as what we're understanding from the Young's Literal Translation: from the time of the turning aside of the perpetual sacrifice and to the giving out of the desolating abomination are days 1290. Now I'm going to say it again in a more proper English, a better English structure. And from the time of removing the sacrifice and to the setting up of the abomination of desolation, their days will be 1290, or those days would be 1290. So what that's telling us is the from and the to It's from the time of the burnt offering and sacrifice to the abomination of desolation is 1290 days. And we're going to see why that's really important. And if people have read Bible prophecy, I think you're already starting to get the idea. Because many people have been, or I had, originally heard many people say that the sacrifice removal and the abomination of desolation are the same time. But based on Daniel 12:11, it doesn't look like they're at the same time. Now, this word two, I don't want to do a big exhaustive study of it, is this lamed. This word two is used 17, this lamed is 17,700 times in the Old Testament. 6,343 times it's translated as the word to. It's also translated as towards, until, for, away from, into, of, about. So it's translated many, many different ways. But any of the ways that you translate that, and toward setting up the abomination, and until setting up the abomination, it's pretty much translated because as to or until. And the reason is because this word mim is translated consistently as from. So even though sometimes it's translated as from, when you see it combined with this word from or mim, you're going to see this translated as to or until. Now, there's out of the many times that it's used, I just wanted to highlight three. It's used in Genesis 1:14. You can see these down here. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse to light the heavens, to separate the day from the night, and let them be 4 signs and 4 seasons and 4 days and years." Daniel 12:2, it's used. "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but to the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." And then it's also used in the very next verse, Daniel 12:12, which we'll look at here in a moment. "How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335 days." So, my suggestion here is that this idea to understand it is from the taking away of the Tamid to the abomination of desolation, there's 1290 days. And we have to ask, what's the context? So how did this play out in history? Was there any time that this has been fulfilled? Has it been fulfilled in the past, or are we still awaiting a future time? Now, the traditional view is that when you take away the tamid, the sacrifice, and the abomination, the two is this question mark. People have and they've speculated, well, what's the 1290 days? What happens after 1290 days? Because they're speculating. Let me show this graphically. So my suggestion is that should be from the daily sacrifice is abolished. There'll be 1290 days to the abomination of desolation. The traditional reading has these both occurring at the same time, the tamid and the abomination taken away. There's 1290 days, but to what? What's the two? What's happening after 1290 days? And people have speculated on all sorts of different things. But I think the plain reading, if you take the Hebrew, the way that it's constructed, it should be this reading. So this is what we should have. Should be what we have right here. So then the question becomes, are these 1290 days literal days, or are they years? So we talked that before about how a day can be substituted for a year, a day can be substituted for an indefinite time period, or a day could be substituted for 1,000 years. Or is this just a day? So let's look at a couple of things. First of all, let's look at how this is used. So let's take a look at Numbers 14:34. Most of the time when God substitutes a day for a year, he'll in very close proximity. It's pretty clear. So in Numbers 14:34, we see, look, according to the number of days which you spied out the land, 40 days, for every day you shall bear your guilt, even 40 years, and you will know my opposition. So what he's saying is, look, I'm going to substitute. So you went to spy out the land for 40 days. And then the Israelites said, no, we can't take the land. So God's going to send them into the wilderness 1 year for every day that they spied out the land. He makes it pretty clear. And in the other situations where we looked at it, when we looked at Ezekiel, we saw that it was pretty clearly substituted a day for a year. We don't see any of that type of construction in Daniel 12:11. If we go back and we look at the context here, there's nowhere in here that it talks about a day for a year. In fact, there is one spot up in here where it talks about that there's going to be a time, times, and half a time. And we see that here in verse 7. It says, I heard a man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river. He raised his right hand and his left towards heaven and swore by him that lives forever. It'll be for a time, times, and half a time. So this context, that's not the word year. It's not the word date. It's the word moed. It's not anything related to a year. That's maybe a season. And we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about that. But what I'm trying to say is it's not related to a year. So based on that, it's not really related. You don't see anything close by. Well, maybe it's related to a close prophecy. So we pretty much most people will agree that Daniel's 70th week, the prophecy there when it's talking about 70 weeks, and it's talking about years. It's talking about a year time frame. Maybe those are related. Since we saw in 9:27, in Daniel 9:27, that he's talking about the abomination that will be one will come who makes will perform the abomination, who will make desolate. Maybe that's related. So let's take a look real quick. So let's take a look at Daniel 9:27. And it says, he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. And the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even till a complete destruction when this decreed is poured on the one who makes desolate. Okay, now we see that there's going to be a stop to the sacrifice, just like we saw before. But it's also for 1 week. So if we want to say that this is the same thing, that this is the same time frame, what does that 1 week indicate? Well, that 1 week indicates actually only 7 years. So if we go back and look through that whole context, it only indicates 7 years. And so everybody is going to pretty much agree. And if this stop sacrifice is in the middle of the week, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to say that somehow this 1290 days is 1290 years. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It would make much more sense to say it's 1290 days, which is 3.5 years plus a month. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to say it's years. And then one other thing to say that this is not years, but it's actual literal days. If we look at when the prophecies were given, we look at Daniel 9:1. Daniel 9 is given in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. Okay. And then Daniel 11, Daniel 12, and 10, 11, 12 is in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So they're not related thematically in terms of right close proximity. They don't see a year right next to it. They're not related in terms of time frame, in terms of the 1 week. Even if they are related in that regard, that's not relating it to years. Even though the entire Daniel 9 prophecy is related to years, that section is not related to more than 7 years. So days makes more sense. And then they're also not related in terms of when they were given, to even be able to say that they're part of the same 70 years, that you're somehow pulling that 1290, making it years. It just doesn't work. So I think the conclusion is that this is actual literal days, that this 1290 time frame would be actual literal days. And we'll look at it more closely when we look at Daniel 9, when we look at that more in depth. Okay. Now, if we were to continue to read in context, Let us take a look here. So we see in Daniel 12:11, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and to the abomination or to the setting up of the abomination of desolation, there will be 1290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335 days. Okay, so this 1335 days. So what is the issue here? What's the from and what's the to? Well, we see that the person who attains to 1335 days will be blessed. Then we have to figure out what that blessing means. But that's the two. We know that there's some blessing at the end of 1335 days. But what's the from? So if we're looking at this, what is the blessing from? What's the starting point? Now you could say, some people say that would be from the abomination of desolation. It could be from the abolishment of the Tamid, or the daily regular sacrifice. It could be from some other starting point. But I think we need to now consider the context of Daniel 11 and 12. So now we're going to take a little more bulk of this study to really understand our context, because that's always one of the important things that I always stress: understanding the context. So let us start. So Daniel 12 is really starting in Daniel 10. So we see this vision that is given to Daniel, and we see that this is in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. A message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belteshazzar. It's a message was of one of great conflict. So we understand that there's going to be a battle, there's a conflict. And when we talk about Daniel 9, we're going to really understand this conflict or this battle. But this is also talking about this conflict or battle. Daniel had been mourning for 3 weeks. We see in verse 2. He did not eat any food. And while he was on the bank of the river, that is the Tigris, he lifted up his eyes, and he looked. Behold, there was a man dressed in linen, who was girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl, and his face had the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches, his arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze, and the sound of his words like a sound of a tumult, sound of many waters, a sound of many different things coming about. I'm going to suggest that this is angel of the Lord vision. This is pre-incarnate Christ, the Logos. Now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nonetheless, great dread fell on them. And I will go back at some point and I will prove what I'm talking about when we talk about other topics. All right, so he was alone that was left in verse 8. Deathly pallor, he turned pale and he retained no strength. And I heard the sounds of his words. And as soon as I heard the sounds of words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face, with my face to the ground. He fell in a deep sleep with his face to the ground when he heard the words. Then the hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees, trembling on his hands and knees. Daniel, a man of high esteem, understand the words I'm about to tell you and stand upright. I've been sent to you. When he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. Do not be afraid, Daniel, from the first day that your heart set on understanding this and humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard. I've come in response to your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia, which was withstanding me 21 days, Michael, one of the chief priests, came to help me. And I have been left there with the king of Persia. Now, look, I'm going to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people in the latter days. This phrase here, latter days, we did not cover all this idea of latter days, but it has an idea of the end. The same thing that Matthew was speaking of, in the end, in the latter days. It pertains to the days yet future. When he had spoken to me according to these words, I turned my face to the ground and was speechless. Okay. So then he goes through all of this about what he's like. He has this conversation. Then he said, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the king, the prince of Persia. I am going forth. Behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. So he's fighting against the prince of Persia, and the prince of Greece is about to come. I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth. Yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince. So this being, I'm going to say in pre-incarnate Christ, there's no one that stands firmly with him except for Michael, your prince. Michael's mentioned twice in this time, and it's going to be mentioned, Michael's going to mention again in 12. Now, what's going to happen? All right. This is in the word of truth. This is what this that he's giving to him. So this is the vision. This is what he's going to talk about, this conflict to come. And it's going to say, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be an encouragement and protection for him. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these verses. I'm going to give an overview. So if we're looking through all of this, the historical context of Daniel 11, 1 through 31 is that if you follow it down, you'll see that it's talking about the Persian Empire and how that lasted from about 550 BC to about 330 BC. So this Persian Empire, and he gives a list of how many more kings there's going to be in this Persian Empire. And then he says that there's going to be this Alexander the Great, and that there's going to be a split of his kingdom. And it's going to go into 4 parts. And then he goes into this great topic about this king of the north and the king of the south. And if you go and look at the king of the north related to the Seleucid Empire and the king of the south related to the Ptolemaic kingdom, I put some videos. If you really want to understand this, I put about 2 or 3 videos in my playlist. If you look at the End Times playlist, if you really want to understand that history and context, it goes all the way through until you get to this vile person down in about verse 30, 29, 30, and goes in 31, who is Antiochus Epiphanes. So if you follow that history through, you find that you're dealing with this person called Antiochus Epiphanes, who is part of the Seleucid Empire. And it talks about how he rose to power and how deceptive and vile he was. But then what he did is in 167 BC, after he lost to the Egyptian army with the help of the Romans, he is enraged and he's upset, and he goes back to his kingdom in the north, which is up near Syria and modern day Turkey. And he goes through Israel, and people had reported that he had been dead and everything like this, and they were upset and they were angry. He was angry and upset because people had reported that he was dead, and so he does this vile thing. He speaks these words of peace, that are going on here. So let's take a look at this in the First Maccabees 41 through 54. So this book of the Maccabees is what's called an intertestamental book. It occurred from the time of the last book of the Old Testament, the time of Jesus. And so it was written about that time, about 150s or so BC. And it talks about this situation that occurred that resulted in a revolt. Okay. So then we're in this verse 41 in First Maccabees. It says, then the king wrote to his whole kingdom. So this is Antiochus Epiphanes. So he wrote to his whole kingdom, king of the north, that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Great idea. That's awesome. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messenger to Jerusalem and towns of Judea, and he directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals. To defile the sanctuary and the priest, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. This was just an abhorrence to the people who wanted to follow Torah. They were abandoning the Abrahamic covenant. They were abandoning the Mosaic covenant. They were committing these acts of abomination. They were to make themselves abominable by every unclean and profane. so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. He added, and whosoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. So let's all be one people. Let's all get along. Let's all have one religion. Let's all do this thing and just get rid of all this other stuff and all rid of all your customs. Oh, and if you don't do it, you're going to die. So either you follow me or you die. That was what was going on. That's what he was doing. Now, in such words, he wrote, verse 51, he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people, commanded the towns of Judah offer sacrifices, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. And they drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Now, on the 15th day of Chislev, in one of the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. Now, this word desolating sacrilege is the same word. If you look at it, it is shekut samem. It's abomination of desolation. And I really, if you've watched the Chosen show, and I like it. I think it's really good. But I think it was just episode 6 of season 4. They're celebrating Hanukkah. They're celebrating the Feast of Dedication. And he mentioned the abomination of desolation. Of what Antiochus Epiphanes did was the abomination of desolation. The Jews understood this. When Jesus' time arose, everyone agreed this was the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Let's take a look. Okay, so this is what's happening. Verse 29, we're going to start in. Daniel 11:29. At the appointed time, he, that is the king of the north, the vile person, will return and come into the south. But this time will not turn out like it did before. So the first time when he came into the south, Antiochus Epiphanes defeated one of the Ptolemies. He left some garrisons there. He went back north, and he comes back this time south. But it doesn't turn out the same way. Ships of Kittim, ships from Rome, will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action. Just exactly what we saw in First Maccabees. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So he spoke smooth words. He regarded people who forsook the Holy Covenant. He liked them. They agreed with him. They forsook it. They stopped circumcising, and they sacrificed swine and all these abominable acts. Then forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words, he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. Which covenants did we just talk about? The Abrahamic covenant. We saw they have them stop circumcision, and the Mosaic covenant. He turned them to godlessness. He had them forsake the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Okay, so great. Yes, Jesus, this was the abomination of desolation. We see in Antiochus, and the Maccabees rose up, and they defeated Antiochus, and they overthrew it, and they came back, and they took the temple back, and they set up Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, because the temple that was profane and desolated, we came back, and we brought it back. But Jesus says in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, spoken of Daniel the prophet, wait a second. I thought this happened 160 years ago. Jesus wrote in 30 AD, and this has happened in 167 BC. What's going on here? What's happening? Wait a second. This prophecy was fulfilled in the past, but Jesus is saying it's yet future. Okay. Let us look at some things. There's some interpretive challenges that we have in Scripture. We have something that I've talked about before. It's called conflation. And we have something that are called types. Okay. So when we're dealing with an interpretive challenge of Scripture, We have to deal with these types of situations. And this is why people are challenged when they're understanding prophecy and why many people get things wrong. Conflation is when we speak of two different events in the same passage. There's two different things going on. When we read Daniel 11, there's actually two different events that are happening, and they're conflated into one event. And the turning point is this abomination of desolation. Where the passage switches is right there. Now, the challenge is there one event or two events? In the regards to the abomination of desolation, Jesus helps us to say there's two events. There's two. It's not just one. It didn't just happen just in 167 BC. It happened then, but it's also going to happen in the future. So we see this of prophecy. Then the part of the passage then also becomes a type. Now, what is a type? A type is when we relate two different events or concepts, but they're not necessarily given in the same passage of scripture. Okay? So the first event becomes a type for the second event. The most common type that we see is Jesus speaking. Let's take a look at John 3:14. We see, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Jesus spoke these words about him being lifted up on the cross as a type of a way of salvation. When the Israelites were in the desert, remember all those snakes and everything came against them, and many were bitten and they were dying. So God instructed Abraham to take a stick and on the pole put a snake on the pole. And if people looked at that snake, they would be healed. All they had to do is look at it and say, I believe that that's going to save me. Jesus is saying, just like that snake, I have to be lifted up. So that snake in the wilderness became a type. They're not saying in the same passage. It's not it wasn't something prophesied beforehand, but Jesus is using it as a type. So the types don't have to be in the same passage, but they can be. So in regards to the abomination of desolation, Daniel 11 is the conflation. The entire scripture passage is conflating two events. And the abomination of desolation is the type. It's the type of something that happened in the past that will then happen in the future. So it's a type of something that will happen in the future. And so we can learn a lot about the event of what happened in the past to learn about the event for the future. So here's the challenge. When Daniel 11 was written, we had two events that were still yet future. There were two events in the same passage that were both future. And it made sense that they would just be one event, but it was very confusing. Let's take a look here. All right. So when certain passages are given, so this passage in Daniel was written here. It was written before Antiochus. It was written in the time of the Persian Empire. So it was written about 300 years before Antiochus Epiphanes. And so when this event came, everyone was like, yeah, they could follow right along. Oh, yeah, look at this. This is the abomination of spoken of by Daniel the prophet. But Jesus is saying, no, it's still yet future. This abomination is still yet future. So what do we see? Let me see if I have my other one here. Okay. So I thought I made a slide of that one. I guess I didn't. Okay. There's two types of conflation. There's what's called a historical future conflation. Basically, when you have a scripture that's given and you're looking at the past as a type for the future. So, for example, we looked at this last week when we looked in Ezekiel regarding the wilderness. So in Ezekiel 20, we see that the elders had come to Ezekiel and they were inquiring of the Lord. And the Lord goes through this whole passage and he tells them about, look, I made myself known to them in the land of Egypt, and I swore to them, saying, I'm your God. I swore to bring them out of the land of Egypt and into the land selected for them. So God is recounting all the things he had done in the past. He's recounting all the things he had done in history. Pretty clear in this regard, right? And then we scroll all the way down and God says, look, I'm not going to be took them out of the land of Egypt. I brought them into the wilderness. So this was this idea of taking them out of Egypt into the wilderness. I gave them my statutes and informed them my ordinances. And he said, look, I won't be inquisitive of you. But then we get down here into verse 33, and it says, as I live, surely with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with wrath poured out, I will be king over you. And I will bring you out of from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you're scattered. So God says he's just like in Egypt in the past, I'm going to do it again. This is historical futurist conflation. I'm looking back at something in the past that I'm then going to do in the future. So this whole passage of Ezekiel 20 is the conflation. The type is bringing them out of the nations like he brought them out of Egypt, taking them into the wilderness like he took them into the wilderness in Egypt, and then bringing them into the promised land like he did when he brought them in the promised land back from Egypt. So the conflation is a historical futurist conflation of the entire Ezekiel 20, and the future types exhibit that past event. But Daniel 11 is not that way. Daniel 11 is a futurist conflation. When Daniel 11 was given, both events were still in the future, which is why it's so hard to understand, because both events were still future. We see this many a times in the scripture, multiple times. When we looked at Leviticus 26, we saw that down in through here that he talks about, remember, the penalty of disobedience, that he's going to inflate the penalties 7 times. And he mentions it 4 times, right? I will strike you 7 times for your sins. I will, and he tells you, I will punish you 7 times for your sins. So look, we're getting it multiple times. These were futurist future conflations. These were things that God was going to do in the future, but that was actually 4 different times he was going to multiply their sins. These are 4 different events of things that were going to happen in the future. So hard to tease out, so hard to understand. We have the benefit because a lot of this has happened in the past. So now all we have to ask is, what is yet future? All right. Now let me give a couple more examples of this futurist conflation. The passages that we looked at in Luke 21, Mark 13, and Matthew 24, when Jesus gave those passages, were futurist conflation. Look, Luke 21. And I've shown this before. When he talks about these things to come and these nations rising against nations, right? All of this right here, this was all this time of the Gentiles. But says, right here, future time for the Gentiles. But before all these things, they will lay your hands on you. So he was conflating actually 3 time periods. He's conflating this time period up until 70 AD. Then he was conflating with the time of the Gentiles. And then he was conflating the future time period. So when he gets this return of Christ, right? So this is going to happen until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars. That's when we jump into that future time period. In Matthew 24, we see something very similar. The difference is in Matthew 24 is he doesn't actually give the time from 30 AD to 70 AD. He only conflates 2 time periods. So there's not that time. He doesn't talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in this Olivet discourse. Remember, these events happen at different time periods. Luke 21 was given in the temple. Matthew 24 was given on the Mount of Olives. They were given 2 different time periods. And we're speaking of similar events. Luke 21 conflates 3 time periods. Matthew 24 conflates 2 time periods. So we see this here. Now, I want to compare this also when you also look at conflation. This conflation is challenging in Matthew 24 because we don't get clear indications when each time period ends. That's what the challenge is. Daniel 11 has the same problem. It's very easy in something like Daniel 2. So, right, Daniel 2:36. we get this conflation, but it completely is understandable. We completely understand it. Well, not completely, but we understand it more fully because look, he tells about who each of these are, who each of these people will be. Look, you are the head of gold. He tells them this. The statue, right? You are the head of gold. After you will arise another kingdom inferior to me, and then a third kingdom, a kingdom of bronze, which will rule over the earth. There will be a fourth kingdom, right? Strong as iron. So we get these time periods that are conflated. God does this over and over in the Bible. The beauty of Daniel 2 is with the statue, the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the feet of clay and mixed with iron, is he gets clear delineations of each of these time periods and it makes it very clear. Daniel 11 is not that way. Only Jesus helps us understand that this is conflating two future events. That's who helps us understand that. Now, the other thing that conflation does is oftentimes the conflation was a near future event for a yet further future event. And what it does is it confirms the prophet. So when we talked about Luke 21, when we talked about what Jesus said, when he said, look, the temple is going to be destroyed, all of these things are going to fall down, that these stones are not going to be left one upon another. That is a near-term prophecy to confirm Jesus as a prophet, so that then you can take his word that the future things would be happening. So Jesus was giving that near-term prophecy to help us understand there's going to be some yet future prophecy. So we're going to look at this. Okay. All right. Let's take a look here. All right. So we looked at this, types and shadows. All right. We looked at this. So this is so maybe most people already had the belief that this had already happened, this abomination of desolation in 167 BC. This is a picture that I picked up offline that somebody had made of that abomination of desolation. Who was the author? James Cole was the engraver, which I found very interesting. Okay. All right. So now the question is was the abomination of desolation fulfilled in 167 AD? Well, it's pretty clear that yes, it was fulfilled, but yet there's still a future anticipation because Jesus tells us there's a future anticipation. So it did not just happen in 167, it also was yet to await some future. And the reason for this is because of the twofold conflation. We see this again and again, this two-part conflation of events. We saw that in Israel's desolation from Babylon was then also showed Israel's desolation in 70 AD. The Babylonian desolation by the Medes and Persians will indicate a yet future nations. This Antiochus desolation was in the past, and there was a yet future one when Jesus gave this in 30 AD. And it will mirror this Antiochus, what happened with Antiochus. So if we don't understand what happened in 167 BC, we're not going to understand what to look for this future abomination of desolation. So we need to understand the historical context to understand what's going to happen in the future. So how do we know that this did not happen in 70 AD? So we're pretty clear that this did not happen it was not completely fulfilled in 167 because Jesus, if we believe Jesus's words, which I do, and which I hope every Bible believing Christian does, that this was a prophecy that was fulfilled, but yet still will be fulfilled in the future. So could it be 70 AD? Now let's take a look. Couple of things. Now, was the abomination of desolation in 70 AD, as some people want to say? Look, 70 AD's destruction was the typology, was the Babylonian destruction. It was a military conquest, but it had complete destruction, right? The city and the temple were destroyed, and the people were taken out of the land. The big difference here is the temple was destroyed. in the type of desolation of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which is the same type as the Babylonian. However, the abomination of desolation, as we've seen, is a different type of desolation. Remember, there's six different types of desolations we talked about. Yes, there is a military conquest. Yes, there's an occupation, right? The people are still in the land. This desolation in Jerusalem, they're coming from outside and they're bringing it in and they're destroying it and taking everyone out. They're wiping it out. This one is a military conquest, yes, but they are still in the land. It's an occupation. They're occupied. Some of the people decide to flee. But look, the temple is not destroyed in this Antiochus abomination. The temple is desolated by the setting up of this abomination, this idea, the shakuts, right? This idol that's being set up. And we saw that in First Maccabees, that he set up. And if we look through and read the rest of Maccabees, we find out that he set up these pillars to Zeus, and he slaughtered a pig on the brazen altars. He desolated the temple, but the temple was not destroyed. So we don't see that in 70 AD. It's a different type of desolation. And people still want to argue that, oh, yeah, no, that's still the same desolation. Okay, I mean, I say the earth is round. Do you want to say the earth is flat? Fine. Yeah, what are you going to argue? You can present all the evidence and all the facts all you want. But if somebody wants to believe what they want to believe, I mean, there's people that believe that Jesus isn't God, right? There's people that want to say, yeah, I'm Christian, but I don't believe in the Trinity. I don't believe that Jesus, when he says I and the Father are one, they don't believe that. Okay, all you can do is present them with evidence, and they're going to decide what they're going to believe. But if you look at and understand this idea of types and conflation and what Jesus was saying in terms of Daniel 11, you'll understand that this is not the same time of desolation. The temple was not destroyed. The temple was desolated, which will be the future, which means it did not happen in 70 AD. So it does not fit. Look, if you combine this with Zechariah 12:2, half the city will remain. Half the city will still be there. And in 12:2, then Jesus is coming back. So the time of the end, the city will be occupied. There'll be people that will agree with what's going on. One religion, yeah, let's have it together. But some are going to flee. Some are going to say, no, that's not right. Some might be taken out of the land, but more of them flee. When the abomination of desolation was set up, the Maccabees and many other people fled. Yes, many were killed by the sword, but many fled. Okay, if you read in through church history, there was no understanding of the abomination of desolation was 70 AD. This wasn't a conversation. Jesus had not returned. The abomination of desolation had not been set up. And the reason is, and we're going to get into that when we talk about Revelation, but if you look through church history, that was still something yet to be future as well. There's so many problems, but just easily, if you understand the context and types, it shows that it's not 70 AD. Now, let me show you a couple other reasons. I'm going to look at Daniel 11:40 through 43. Okay. So to say that this happened in 70 AD, all right, I'm going to start in 30, kind of one down here. All right. So we saw that this abomination was set up. He'll turn to godlessness. So those who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, right? And they will fall by the sword and the flame, by captivity, by plunder for many days. So when the Maccabees rose up and they were standing up saying, this isn't right, many of them died. Many of them were plundered and killed. When they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Okay, so did this happen in 70 AD? Is this type something future that happened in? Okay, so they rose up. They fought against it. They said, this isn't right. But the abomination had already occurred when they rose up to fight. The occupation was already there. This battle in 70 AD is coming from outside. Remember, Rome surrounded them. They starved the people out. People were eating children and babies, and hurting one another inside the city. There was famine and plague. They weren't let out. There was no battle coming in from the Romans from the outside. This was inside the city when they were capturing it. Didn't happen in 70 AD. Verse 36. Then the king will do as he pleases. Okay, that's 70 AD. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. Okay, yeah, I could see that you could say that that's what happened in 70 AD. Was it the king of the north? No, okay. Seems a little bit far fetched to say that Tiberius, I mean, he did become emperor, so maybe. Look, verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or the desire of women, nor will they show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above all. I don't know that he really did that. Um, and this is also not really a complete type for Antiochus either. Um, and that's why many people think that this is still future. Instead, he'll honor a god of fortresses, a god his fathers did not know. Okay. We're getting into speculation for 70 AD, but that's okay. It could be. He will take action against the strongest of fortresses and help them with a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, which, yeah, I can imagine that happen. He'll cause them to rule over many and will parcel out land for a price. Okay, maybe he's parceled out land. Maybe Tiberius offered people money and land and things like that. Okay. At the end time, so now we're talking about the end time. Well, didn't Jesus just say, and then the end will come? So this is really also talking about the end time. You can say, well, at the end time of Jerusalem, for this time period, this is talking about the end time. Okay, maybe we can make that for 70 AD. I'm trying to be very gracious here. I already think that it's not, but I'm trying to be gracious from this perspective. But I want to show a couple things. Look, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots. Wait a second. In 70 AD, there was no one else that came against the Roman army at that time. And many people who want to say that this is what happened, they'll shift it to Europe and they'll shift it a couple hundred years in the future. And they'll say that Germany came against them and other people out of the south came against Rome because then everything shifted to Rome. Okay, but then that's not really 70 AD. The abomination of desolation becomes the only thing that happens in 70 AD, and these are even further future time periods. This is really talking about Israel and Jerusalem and the people. So I don't really think that this really applies. I think we're making stretches. And what they do is this is called a historicist view, which basically takes everything and transfers the things from Israel, then becomes part of the church, right? So Rome, the church, now becomes this type of person, and people are storming against them. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. Okay, the beautiful land clearly is Israel. So to say that this, and now we're jumping back to Israel. So people are saying, oh, this is the Crusades, and people are falling. Okay. Some will be rescued out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the foremost sons of Ammon. Okay, that was controlled by Rome at that time. They're not being really rescued out of his hands. Then they will stretch out his hand against other countries. The land of Egypt will not escape. Okay, Egypt did not escape. He'll gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt. The Libyans and the Ethiopians will follow at his heels. Okay, maybe the Ethiopians and the Libyans, they did control the north coast of Africa and down through Ethiopia. But rumors from the east and north will disturb him, and he'll go forward with great wrath. Again, I think that we're trying to shoehorn something in. If we want to say that verses Daniel 11:32 through 45 indicate some future time period and the abomination of desolation happened in 70, then we're trying to shoehorn that rest of that history into some makeshift history that we're pulling out to make it fit into the text, rather than just taking Jesus's words and saying, yes, that's still future. That the type of Antiochus's destruction is a future type when the end times come. So I think if you take all that information, you have to say that the abomination of desolation is still yet future. that it's not some past event only, that it happened here, yes, but it's going to happen in the future at the time of the end. Why do we have a hard time dealing with it? We have a hard time dealing with uncertainty, right? How anxious do people get for the future when something's coming up? I have a speaking engagement. I have to go talk about it. We get anxious and nervous. And when we're done, we're like, oh, that's done. I'm glad I got that off my table. Yes, it's in the past. I don't have to worry about it anymore. And I think when we deal with something that's in the future, it creates anxiety and we get worried about it. All right. So remember, we're still looking at relationship to Daniel 12, 12. We're trying to understand what this blessing is. And so we're going for this blessing. And so because of that, we've come up to this time period, which I'm going to call the time of the end. So this time of 30, this verse 32, all the way down to 45 is going to be yet future time period, that something is going to come about in the future. And we're going to see other passages that help us to mirror and understand this time period. So it says here at the end, it says, he will pitch tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. This is an idea that that he will be destroyed at the end, that some future time period, his end will come about, which is a lot of what we see in other scripture verses. But that doesn't end. Remember, the Daniel 11 and 12 are actually one contiguous vision. So we see now at that time, of what's going on, of this future time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress, as such never has occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who's found in the book of life, will be rescued. What is this idea of rescue? He's going to stand up. There'll be a time of distress. What does that sound like? Well, if we go back and look, it sounds like Matthew 24:16, where it tells them to flee, and that there's going to be a time of great tribulation, that there's going to be a time of distress. And then Michael will rise up and they will be rescued. What does that rescue sound like? Sounds like when they're going to be gathered back together. What Jesus was talking about them being gathered back together. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And what does this sound like? Resurrection language. Again, times of the end, times of something that's going to be yet future. And if somebody wants to say that Jesus has already returned, that the resurrection has already happened, run. That's heresy. The church has never taught that. There's been no teaching about that. And every time that it was taught, it was told as heresy. It was told, Paul talked about that. People want to say, well, if that was Paul wrote before 70 AD, this all happened in 70 AD. No, it didn't. And so it's heresy. Run from it. Don't believe that Jesus has returned. Just as the sun, the lightning comes from the east, it's going to be some major event. People are going to recognize it. No one ever wrote that Jesus had returned in 70 AD. Never in church history. No one witnessed it. He had a secret coming in 70 AD. They laugh at a secret rapture, but we can laugh at a secret second coming, a secret resurrection. Okay, so this mirrors what Jesus talks about in Matthew 24. There'll be a time of distress, great tribulation. People will be rescued. They'll be gathered, and there'll be a time of resurrection. So we end with this idea of awake, with this idea of resurrection. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse in heaven, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever. Okay, so now it says, for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up this book until the time of the end. Okay, so that pretty much stops that kind of historical view. So now we can go back and ask, what is that blessing? What's that blessing that we're looking at? So not 70 AD. So, excuse me, how I would read this is that from the end of the regular sacrifice, from the Tamid, there's 1,290 days until the abomination of desolation. Then from the abomination of desolation, there'll be an event of something being blessed. Now, that to me is the natural reading. If you want to say that this 1,335 days is here at the Tamid, well, then that means there would be 45 days after the abomination of desolation. Let's take a look at some of these. Yeah, I guess I didn't put that slide in there. Okay. So our pretty much our options are that these days overlap or it's this entire time period. All right. So going back to our pretty one, we learned that, and I'm going to suggest that there's 1,290 days from the Tamid being taken away, this regular sacrifice, to the abomination of desolation. There's 1,335 days until a blessing. Now, the question is what that blessing is. Well, we just learned about the resurrection. There's a resurrection that's going to happen. There's also, is that gathering the elect? There's also going to be a time in the wilderness, a year of redemption, or time in the wilderness, time that he'll gather the elect of Israel. Is there some blessing going on there? There's the millennium. Is the blessing the millennium? So this blessing, there's a lot of different options for what this blessing is. It's really questionable what it is. Now, let's take a quick look. If we look at this word blessing, I'm not going to do a complete study because we're looking at timeline. We're not looking at events, right? If the event is not clear, I'm just going to leave it as an event. So there's some blessing that occurs, and I'm leaving it as a question mark. I'm putting the resurrection in here because that's an event. I'm putting the gathering of the elect because it's an event. These other things are events, and I'm putting them in there. But the blessing doesn't tell us what it is. So what is blessing associated with? So blessing can be, it often talks about blessed is the man who does something in the name of the Lord. Blessed are the people that are in relationship to God or that are doing good deeds, or blessed are the people that know God, or blessed is the man who knows God. It's some type of relationship with God or doing something good that somebody receives a blessing for if you look at the context. So that's just kind of a quick aside. All right. Now, we also have the end of these wonders. Okay, so let's talk about 12:6 real quick. We're almost done with this. So when we go down here, we see that it is conceal the words, seal up the book. And Daniel looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river and one on the other bank. One said to the man dressed in linen, so asked the man in linen, who was above the waters, how long will it be till the end of these wonders? And that's where the man in linen looks up and raises his hand left and right and swore him by him as ever that it will be for a moed, a moedim, and half. Okay. So it'll be for, they call it time, times, and half a time. But we need to understand that that's why I'm going to start using some Hebrew words. Moed, moedim, and half. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all of these events will be completed. This is relationship to the holy people. Okay, this is relationship to Israel. So the end of the event could also be something to do with Moedim. It could be something to do with times and times. And we're going to, again, start to be building out this timeline. All right, so let us look. This is the timeline that I'm going to be building, and I'm going to be putting things in here. So we have this abomination of desolation, which we know about. The Tamid ends, the sacrifice ends, and there's 1,290 days. Then there are 1,335 days. And I broke this into 1,260 days and 75 days. And when we get to that point, you'll kind of see why I did that. All right. So that's pretty much it. And I think the main takeaway is this, um, that when we're building the timeline, what we're looking for is this abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. But when we go back to Daniel the prophet, we find that when the regular sacrifice is taken away. Now, I want to make one more comment about the regular sacrifice. Talk about the holy place. Many people associate the holy place and the sacrifice with temple, and they want to know, does the temple have to be rebuilt? Well, before Solomon built the first temple, where was the holy place? The holy place was in a tent. They had just built a tent, and they created the holy place, an inner sanctuary, and then that was the most holy, and then the holy place was kind of inside the tent, and then outside was where the sacrifices occur. And when somebody had the sacrifice, they go into the next part of the tent, the holy place. So it doesn't mean that a temple has to be rebuilt. All it has to be is something that somehow worship God, that signifies that for the Jewish people, that's what it is. Could it be a temple? Could it be a tent? Don't know. This is why we have to watch and wait. This is why we need to study more so that we're not surprised. We don't want to be like the people in the Maccabean time period who um, went along with Antiochus Epiphanes, who said, yeah, let us abandon the good covenant that God has given us. Let us all have one religion, or whatever he's going to say. Let us not sacrifice these abominable things or perform these abominable acts. The people who knew their God rose up. The people who recognized these things stood up. It's going to be a challenge to be able to stand up and recognize these things. But we should understand that the abomination, a desolation as an event, is probably going to be some type of idol, something that's set up, something that somebody is going to put somewhere that's abominable to God, that's detestable, that is a worship to another God or another being. Um, but the time periods, do they really help us? Or are the events what's really important? And I think the time periods are helpful because if we're called to endure, if we have to endure these things, or we have to teach somebody to endure, it's easier to know how long you have to endure something if you know how long it's going to be, right? If somebody put me in a torture chair and they say you have to endure these shocks for 30 minutes, it's going to be much easier to endure than if you just think it could go on forever. If you think that that's never going to end and it's never going to stop, it's hard to endure making it through that time period. So I think from that standpoint, time periods can be very helpful in that regard. So, and even God told the Israelites, look, when you go into the Babylonian captivity, you're going to be gone 70 years. It's much easier to endure when you know that time period. When you don't know how long it's going to be, it's hard to endure. It's hard to last that time period. So time periods, I think, can be very helpful. And so I think we shouldn't just go, oh, I don't need to know the time. I don't need to know how long these things are going to be, um, because for the endurance of the saints. And then the second part is knowing the events. If we don't understand how those events happened in the past and what they translate into the future, we're going to miss it. We're going to misunderstand what's going on. And God gives us examples in the past to look for the future. I think the hardest part would have been being an Israelite back at the time of Egypt and Moses, because you had nothing to look for in the past. I think I watched The Chosen, like I said before, seeing Jesus come the first time and only having the Old Testament references and all those things conflated together and all those prophecies, it would have been a challenge. I would have had a hard time knowing what Jesus was talking about. I would have been confused, I think, too. We are blessed during this time. The hardest part is there's so much false information out there. Christianity has spread so far and wide. There's been so many false teachers, so many false prophets. It's hard to cut through. So, how did I cut through all this? Well, the first thing I said is, give me Bible. Only give me the scriptures. I want to know what's true. And so I take the Old Testament and then take the words of Jesus. And then I wanted to know which scriptures could I trust? How do I know I can trust all of Paul's letters? How do I know I can trust Revelation and 1st and 2nd John and 1st and 2nd Peter? And so then I went through and looked at it. And then I looked at all the books that might have made it in, right? I looked at the Epistle of Barnabas and letters of St. Ignatius and First Clement. I went and looked at all these scriptures. Did they say something different? Then I looked at all the ones that people talked about that were heresies in the New Testament and those people that were almost made it. And what did they say? And then I compared those things. I went through and looked at how could I trust the doctrine of the Trinity? So I went through and looked at all the scripture passages and studied the doctrine of the Trinity and looked at where does it say Jesus is God? Where does it say the Holy Spirit is God? How do we know that they're related to one another? I went through and looked at all of those, both sides of the argument, both sides. And it's pretty clear. So you have a grounding of who Jesus is. You have a grounding of the Old Testament and the New Testament. I looked at the early church councils, Council of Nicaea, Council of Chalcedon. I looked at these early scriptures. Not early scriptures, early councils. And I pretty much stopped at about 450 BC, AD. I pretty much stopped there. Because after that, you really start to notice schism. You really start to notice more schism. Up until that point, they were pretty well unified. They came together in councils. They came together, and the bishops came together. So that's how I really took that. And then I looked at all the branches and the people that said that there's a new revelation. Well, what does it say about Jesus? Oh, Mormonism doesn't say the same thing about Jesus as the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'm sorry, not going to buy it. And there's many other reasons. Jehovah's Witness, all these other groups that say we have the right, we have the knowledge, we have the gnosis, right? That was the Gnostic heresy. The Gnostic heresy of the 1st and 2nd centuries. We have special knowledge. Come with us. We've been granted the secret book that's not given to everybody else. The ones the disciples held back. Right. And that's why they call them the different ones, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Matthias and all these other books that they put a disciple's name on. But as they said, Justin Martyr or Irenaeus said, there are 4 gospels like there's 4 areas of the globe or 4 winds of heaven. There's 4 gospels. That they knew early on that there were 4 gospels. This is how we get grounded in our faith and not get distracted by all this extraneous stuff that's all around us. It's a challenge. It's difficult. And so how do we deal that with prophecy? How do we look to the future? It's hard. It's hard because these events have not yet taken place. We can allegorize. We can try to make it some type of spiritual thing. But I think as soon as we start to say that the church, I think the biggest thing is if somehow the church has replaced Israel in the teachings or of a prophecy teacher, that would to me would be a red flag, because that would basically be saying that the God of the Old Testament, all the promises he made to Israel about the land, and go back and look at my videos on the millennium, all the promises he made about the land and bringing his people back to the land and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and putting the people there, he can't accomplish, or he won't accomplish, or he lied. Because these were promises, and they were not made for Israel's sake. They were made for God's sake, so that he would be proved who he is, that he can maintain his people. And we see that today with Israel being back in the land. It's Israel being around for 1900 years, that he could sustain and maintain his people, because they become a witness. And so that would be one thing I would say about looking forward to prophecy. Um, and then have discussions, be open, look at both sides, look at the possibilities, and you're going to have to make decisions. We had, you see today, I had to make some hard decisions. I had to make some decisions about, hey, whether this happened in 70 AD, because as soon as you say that this happened in 70 AD, that really leads you down a really dangerous path. That oh, if the abomination of desolation happened, oh, does that mean Jesus returned? Oh, does that mean the resurrection already happened? What about the gathering of the people? Oh, then we spiritualize it. Oh, the gathering is the church, right? So um, these are really important decisions that we'll make, that will impact us. All right. Well, anyways, I this one's a little bit shorter. I don't know if I ran through it fast. Hopefully, it made a lot of sense. But that's pretty much the abomination and desolation. And the main thing I want to take away, that this is going to be our beginning structure of timeline, and this is, we're adding to this structure here, and we added the resurrection, and we added here this little yellow thing of Michael rising up, and we added the desolate one, the vile one, the king of Tyr, here in Daniel 11, 31 through 45, starting with the abomination of desolation and all the events that will happen. And he will come to his end here in 45. Really didn't add a lot for Israel, although we could add something here about, we saw a little bit with Michael with the tribulation, and we see that, look, there's a great tribulation. We see that the gathering, and we just added the resurrection. So it really wasn't anything new here. It just added and reinforced what Jesus already told us. If anyone is out there and has any questions, go ahead and throw them up. Um, see if anyone's still there. Yeah, still got about 3 people. All right. Any questions by anybody? I'll give it a moment because I know it takes a bit for the chat to come through. Was anybody here in the beginning, got a chance to listen to the music? Keep on spreading the message, brother. Edward Span for King Z. All right. Well, I do appreciate everyone who has tuned in and everybody who's been watching. Um, and hopefully, um, hopefully we'll get to Daniel 9 here shortly and expand on our timeline and our events, and go from there. Anyways, everyone take care. God bless, and peace.